Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the AERO South Africa webinar in conjunction with Mayday-SA. And tonight we'll be talking about a subject called Cleared for Takeoff, Returning to Flying, a Pilot's Guide. My name is Neil Piper, the Head of Content for Messi Frankfurt, South Africa, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jaco van der Westhuizen, who will be introducing Mayday South Africa, and our guest speaker for the evening, Paul Dickens. Jaco started his career as an air traffic controller in the SA Air Force and worked at OR Tambo International as an aerodrome controller until 2001. He then migrated towards human factors as a result of his ergonomics and psychological subjects and his personal experiences of aviation incidents. His qualifications range from a bachelor's in human movement science to a master's in business leadership and a PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Pretoria. We're thrilled to have you on the session with us tonight, Jaco. So thank you for making the time and welcome. And I'm handing over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Good evening, everybody. We are truly excited about tonight and our guest speaker, Mr. Paul Dickens. And so if you would allow me for one moment just to introduce you briefly to Mayday and what Mayday stands for. Mayday started in August of 2012 at Rand Airport as a result of the Tanin Albatross disaster that we all know very well. And there was a desire expressed by the industry for an independent body to provide that type of support to aviators, to license holders. And from there, Mayday was born. And Mayday is a peer-to-peer based service that we provide to any license holders, to any aviator, whether it is you're going through family trouble, whether it's training challenges, whether it is health or your medical licensing, whether it is just life stresses in general, or even professional or aviation-based trauma that you've experienced, maybe a serious incident that you've been through. That's where my experience comes from, is from incidents, actually, to be honest. The one thing we cannot help you with is if you've got trouble with your mother-in-law. There we would have to draw the line. But for all the rest, we are able to support you. It's, as I said, volunteer peers that knows the industry, that understands the challenges and the constraints that our license holders work in on a daily basis. And that's why it's so effective as a program in supporting aviators. And as a result of that, we crossed paths with Mr. Paul Dickens that I would like to introduce to you. He actually is so well versed in presenting this Cleared for Takeoff offering that he's done it to for 1,500 Spanish pilots a couple of months ago. Tonight he's speaking to us from a very cold Scotland, a place near to Edinburgh. And he specializes apparently in whiskey as well. So maybe you can ask him a couple of questions about that afterwards. So Paul is holding honors in psychology as well as a master's degree in clinical psychology. He's a chartered psychologist. He's a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He's an accredited aviation psychologist, and he's also a member of the European Association of Aviation Psychology. Initially, he started his career in the National Health Services. And at the moment, or also before that, he dealt with boards, with directors, with chief executives, senior management, and other team members in the UK, Italy, Germany, Austria, France, as well as the USA, UAE, and as far as Australia. Currently, he's working exclusively in the aviation industry. And he's, I know some people would say those are not real aircraft, but under rotor wing, he is, one of his clients is Leonardo Helicopters, Bristow, Babcock, Offshore, Unifly, as well as Universal Helicopters. And on top of that, he's also working in the fixed wing domain for DHL Air, for West Atlantic, and for Wizz Air, to name but a few. He's also a member of the ICAO Mental Health Working Group and the UK CAA Crew Health and Wellbeing subgroup. Ladies and gentlemen, we will not be able to find a more experienced and versed person to speak to us about cleared for takeoff. How do we get back onto the flight deck or back into the cockpit in a safe way? May I introduce to you, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Dickens.
Thank you. I will share my screen with you with a bit of luck. Where are we? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody from, I think as Jaco has said, it's a very cold and gradually getting dark Scotland. It's a bit surreal, this. I've been doing quite a number of webinars to people right across the world, and it just feels so strange that I'm sitting here a good few thousand miles away talking to you in sort of very different conditions and situation than usual, but I think it's a thing of the moment. Jaco has given me an introduction, so I'll just go through just a few things just to reiterate, so you know who I am and why I come to be doing this particular session. That's you know my name, as I'm a registered clinical psychologist. I don't practice as a clinical psychologist as such only in the context of aviation, but I obviously have to keep up to date to keep my registration, and I'm accredited as an aviation psychologist. Strangely, I got into this working with manufacturers, which is rather a strange way into it, and worked particularly with Airbus and a few others you may recognize there. But now it's all with operators. And a large part of my practice falls into three areas. I guess one is the major scheduled airlines like Jet2.com, Wizz Air, Avianca, South American Airline. The freight operators, DHL, West Atlantic Cargo, Logic Air, who have been very interesting because, of course, they haven't been affected as much by the furloughing and shutdown that's occurred in most of the scheduled airlines. And in fact, if you talk to people in the freight operators, they've been busier than ever because they've been delivering things like PPI to people, and they've been certainly active in shipping vast quantities of supplies around the world. The other area I work a lot with is helicopters, as Jaco has indicated. Mainly what I do falls into two categories: aircrew psychological assessment. I provide that to operators. Some of you may be aware that EASA has published a regulation which applies across Europe that comes into force on the 14th of February next year, which requires all pilots to go through psychological assessment before they commence line operations with an operator. So that's coming into force next year, and is part of the new regulations that came out of the German Wings accident in 2015. The other part of my work is in pilot support, which is where I interact with pilot support programs. A good example, obviously, being Mayday South Africa. But also I'm involved in setting up pilot support programs with operators, because another part of the regulation coming is that every operator has to offer to pilots, in fact to all aircrew, a confidential, independent pilot peer support program. The other part of pilot support I get involved with is individual work with pilots who get referred to me either by themselves, by aviation medical examiners, by operators, by the UK CAA, and I see them for individual assessment and also treatment. Very typically, I get involved with pilots, particularly who are suffering anxiety conditions, specifically often around the sim. I think has been said, I represent the UK on an ICAO mental health working group. Within the UK, I'm also on a Civil Aviation Authority crew health and wellbeing subgroup, which is a subgroup within the CAA, which is looking at all the regulations and implementation and audit of the support programs that are coming in in next year. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and this is a picture of me trying to fly that thing. If you are a pilot, you'll probably know it is a Robinson R-22, which doesn't have a great safety record, mainly because it's people like me flying them. I'm not making much progress, unfortunately. One of the issues with flying an R-22 is you need really good eye-hand coordination because of the sensitivity of the controls. Unfortunately, I don't have good eye-hand coordination, so I struggle, and I'm probably not safe and should probably go on to flying fixed wing, although the same issues might well apply. But it's been great fun trying to fly that, and it's certainly an experience. Okay, I'm here to talk about the guide I produced in April called Clear for Takeoff. This was something I did at the very start of the quarantine or lockdown process. And it was done really for a number of reasons. A, it was to keep me occupied, but B, it's because I could see there was a need for people understanding how they then go back through the process of getting back to work. By nature, I am an optimist. And I think the guide was really saying to people, look, at the end of this, there will be some way back into operating and you will need to get back into work. And it's not quite as easy as suddenly just putting the uniform on and going and turning up and flying the aircraft. And so the guide was really put together as a way of encouraging people to do some planning now about their return to work. Now, in some jurisdictions, obviously that process has begun to happen. In others, it hasn't. When I made the guide up, it was certainly picked up a lot in Europe. It then went worldwide. I'm beginning to regret not having charged for it because I think something like 65,000 copies have been downloaded. And I began to think if I'd only charged £1 for it, but anyway, it wasn't about making money. It was about providing a service. It's available on our website. If you haven't already got it, I'll give you the reference at the end. It's available in French, Italian and Spanish as well as English, unfortunately not in Afrikaans. So if there's somebody out there who'd like to translate it, I'm very happy if you want to do that. Speak to me later. Okay, what are you going to hear in this presentation? Well, a number of things. Firstly, about why I thought this guide was needed. What was the background and the context for this at the time? Excuse me, go back again. Sorry, this is an awkward thing. There we go. Yep, got it. Sorry about that. My controls are very sensitive on my laptop, so it may happen again. But the main part of the guide is around how you look after a number of things. First of all, your physical well-being, your body. Secondly, your thinking processes, your brain. Thirdly, your emotions, how you handle the feelings of being out of work and then going back into work. The fourth area is really how you work around your relationships, because they will have changed and will change again once you return to work. And lastly, how you look after yourself, which is the fundamental thing around everything within this guide. And we'll refer back to that when we get to that point. But just to start this off, here's a funny little video, which I think is quite a good way of indicating things.
I'll just get us started.
We'll need that to live.
Quite like that. So why was this guide needed? Well, a number of reasons. We know, and you will know, many scheduled airlines have shut down in many countries. Many pilots are inactive and continue to be inactive, even though operations have begun to restart. That's mainly because most operations are restarting in a phased mode. The other thing that's happening currently, certainly within the UK, is that operations that had restarted are now stopping again because of the change in the COVID-19 situation in various places. One of my clients, Jet2.com, has now announced yesterday that all flights from the UK to Spain and Portugal mainland will cease until next year, even though they'd started up again. That's because of a change in the circumstances regarding quarantine and also the incidence rate of COVID-19 in those jurisdictions. We know quarantine can have negative effects on well-being and mental health. We'll look at some of the data on that in a minute. And we know that there is an increased incidence of anxiety, depression, and confusion amongst people as a result of being in the lockdown situation. But at the same time, people have also reported some positive aspects. People have enjoyed time with their family, which they maybe didn't have as much of. And particularly if you are a scheduled airline pilot listening to this, you will know that actually that's a big change, because instead of the usual rosters and schedules and so on, you maybe have had more time to spend with the family and kids. Also, people have learned new skills. Some people have become physically fitter. Certainly applies to me. During the main part of lockdown here, when we weren't really allowed to travel at all, I live in the countryside. I was able to walk 5-6 miles a day, and did that as a way of keeping fit, both physically and mentally. We also know that going back to work in any profession needs a settling in period of transition, whether that's because of things like maternity leave or a long period of sickness, or even just an absence doing something else. Getting back into the workplace needs a process, and it needs a period of transition. So the guide was really intended at managing that transition process, and is an addition to the sorts of things that most operators will be putting in place, and indeed have begun to put in place for pilots returning to duty. And that's exactly what will be happening. Formal arrangements for the formal proficiency requirements, and most airlines are doing that already as they begin to ramp up more operations. And as we know, that I've covered off 5 main areas of readjustment, and they're personal readjustment. They're things for you to do. It's not about what the organization needs to do. I haven't covered that at all. It's about what people need to do for themselves. That was the intention with the guide. I mentioned earlier that there had been quite a number of increases in mental health difficulties. This is reports from a couple of studies that were done, certainly in the UK and in Ireland, with large numbers of people. And what we have seen is an increase in depression. We've seen an increase in anxiety, and the two combined. And you can see some of the things that are associated with that. People being younger, quite an increase in anxiety and depression in young people. People being female gender, people who've lost income, people who have had the infection themselves, and people who have also a higher perceived personal risk of COVID-19 infection. So these are the findings. A number of papers have been published recently about the negative impacts on people's mental health as a result of the lockdown and the COVID-19 situation. There's been a big study done by Trinity College in Dublin, looking specifically at the impact of this on aviation. And this is some of their findings. And you can see the title, My Mental Health Has Worsened. And you can see that a large number of people in all categories in aviation. This is a survey of 2,050 aviation staff carried out in August. You will see that a significant proportion are saying they are strongly agreeing that their mental health has worsened. And that goes across pilots, cabin crew, air traffic control, maintenance, and others. The others include general aviation pilots, some of whom you may be in that category, I understand. So it does show that there has been an impact. So the need for the guide, even though it was done at the start of this process, I think is now illustrated more than ever. So hopefully what follows will be something which allows you to understand and work on some of the things that that you need to do. In case you think this is possibly a little bit abstract, it's not. Don't know if you remember this crash that happened, this accident happened in Pakistan at the very start of lockdown in March. Pakistani Airlines flight attempted a landing with a gear up. Actually, I think hit the runway, did a go around, obviously lost both engines, and then crashed into a residential area close to the runway. We know from the cockpit voice recordings that the pilots were distracted. The distraction was they were discussing the coronavirus pandemic, and they seem to have, as a result of that, been disorientated, lost situational awareness, lost control of the aircraft. It's worth having a look at the accident report on that. I think it's only a preliminary report, some more may come out, but it's obvious that the impact there was very directly on aircraft safety. We also know from an IATA survey regarding unstable approaches, and it's shown that during the reduced operational period, there was quite an increase in unstable approaches. And I believe this is still continuing. And some of that is to do with the reduced frequency of traffic, and some of it we think is possibly due to distraction and lack of familiarity with the task. It continues to happen. A number of reports have been coming out in the UK about pilots just being slightly unused again to getting back in the cockpit and doing the task, and therefore having things like unstable approaches as a result of that. So it's having an impact on safety, and it's absolutely having an impact on people's mental health. Okay, what can you do about it? Well, that's what this guide is about. And if you remember, I talked about 5 areas, and what I'm going to do is go through those 5 areas. If as we go through this, you have questions, please pop it into chat. The chat is being monitored. At the end of the time, I'll pick up the questions. It's just not easy to do it as we go through during the course of the presentation, but I'm certainly able to answer questions. If by any chance you have a question which you'd rather not put in the public domain, if it's something personal about you, then I will put my email address up at the end. I'm quite happy to take any questions if they're a bit more personal that you don't want to put into the public domain. I'm quite happy to do that. And please feel free to email me. The email address will come up at the end. Okay. The first part of this is about getting your body prepared for returning to work. What we know is your body and the way in which your body operates will have changed, because you will have been used to operating a certain way. You'll have been used to being in the cockpit, sitting down for perhaps lengthy period of times in a pressurized cabin, and that will have changed. Because during the lockdown, you'll have been in a much freer situation. You'll have been able, okay, not to travel and maybe go that far from your house, but you will have at least have been able to move around. You'll have been able to sleep more frequently and more thoroughly. You'll have been able to eat a different way. So your body will have readjusted into that situation and now faces the prospect of adjusting back again into the physiological aspects of operating an aircraft. So we know that some bodily readjustment is necessary in order to get back into being fit and healthy in the cockpit. And of course, if you have followed a fitness regime, one of the worst things you can do is do that and then suddenly stop it, because you're then back into work mode. So part of the encouragement for you is to maintain whatever physical regime you've got into and find ways of using that as you move back into cockpit activity. And so with each of these, there is a checklist. The first thing to do in terms of getting your body prepared again, particularly if you're a pilot with a scheduled airline, is adjust your sleep patterns. You'll have got used to a relatively normal pattern of sleeping and waking. Your bodily rhythms will have shifted. So it's worthwhile getting back into something approaching what you were doing before when you were working. And that means adjusting those patterns back again. It may mean getting up earlier. It may mean working on later into the evening, something which approximates your normal pattern of working. So begin to adjust that just now, because it often takes time for the body to readjust and for sleep patterns to become normalized again. And that really is around aligning them to your usual flight schedule. What was your pattern of working beforehand? I do understand that might be different now because the flight schedules and rosters may well have changed, but at the same time, how were you working before? And how can you readjust to that? It might seem odd if you were used to 5 o'clock reports to actually getting back to a sleep pattern that accommodates that, even when you're not working. It does seem odd, but it's a vital part of preparing yourself and your bodily function for returning to duty. It's worthwhile putting an exercise regime in place now to maintain the physical fitness if you have increased that. If you haven't, I think there's a lovely slide somewhere which shows a whole pile of pilots with very large waistlines sitting waiting to get briefed about returning to work. If you have been in that situation, then obviously then an exercise regime might be necessary. It's certainly been the case for many people that they've put on weight because they've been eating more frequently and different meals. So it's worthwhile getting that exercise regime in place. If you get a copy of the guide, you will see a reference in it to an FAA document called, I think, Fit for Flight or Fit for Flying, which is exactly about that. And it does give you some suggestions as to how you can maintain physical fitness in normal aircraft operations. It's well worth getting hold of. You can download it directly. If you get the guide, you can click straight on the link, which will take you into the FAA website to download the guide. It's also worth now planning for a healthy diet. I do know many pilots don't have a great healthy diet when they're in operations, particularly on scheduled airlines. I come across a lot of this with the freight operators I work with, because, you know, freight operations, there's just the 2 people on the aircraft. There isn't, there aren't cabin crew to provide meals and heat up food and so on. So often diet isn't great. So it's worthwhile thinking now how you can maintain a healthy diet when you work in that situation. And that's again part of the preparation for getting your body fit and used to operating and maintaining some of the benefits that you might have had from being out of the cockpit for a duration. So that's the first part, getting your body prepared, but that's only one element of the whole element of well-being. So let's move on and look about how you get your brain prepared. If any of you have had any time off, significant time off, you will know it's actually very difficult to get your head back into work mode again. I was lucky enough at one stage when I worked in the National Health Service that I was allowed a month's break every year. So I used to take a month out every year and we'd go to places like Turkey or somewhere and literally be out of the work mode, which was great because it allowed you to really get back into your own space again. However, what I always noticed was how difficult it was to ramp up into work again once I returned to work. So a month out often meant 2 or 3 weeks of readjustment and getting back into the workplace. And it happens even with a relatively short break. So it's no surprise that it's much harder if you've had a lengthy period of time out of work, if you've been not working for a time, not been in the cockpit environment. What we do know is that pilot skills can deteriorate in 3 specific areas through lack of use. And I think that goes back to what the IATA findings were. And these 3 are situational awareness, which is again, what is coming out from some of the issues regarding particularly overspeed on approach, problem solving, which is normally a very key skill in the cockpit, as we well know, but actually not having practiced that for a while means the skills can certainly begin to get a bit rusty. And also decision making. And again, if you think back to perhaps when you're not working, when you're on vacation, the decision-making process can change. You don't have to make decisions. And I know myself, I'm quite a decisive person when I'm working. But if I go on holiday, my wife will say to me, where will we eat tonight? And I'll go, oh, I don't know, I can't make my mind up, I just don't know. And that's usually because I'm out of the decision-making mode. And that becomes a specific issue when it is required, particularly in the cockpit. So those three areas are skill areas that really do need to be worked on during the period of ramping up back into operations again. So if we look at these, then what are the things you can do practically to get back into the headspace of aviation? And just to show you what can happen with situational awareness, this is an accident that happened at the start of lockdown, where two planes sort of certainly lost situational awareness. It's a bit of an unusual one, that, because actually what happened was the brakes failed on the plane on the left-hand side because it had been out of action for some time. It was the ground handlers that lost situational awareness, not to the pilot. There were no pilots on board at the time. So how do you get your brain prepared? Well, the first thing to do, begin to put some time aside to spend in work mode. If you haven't been doing so, speak to colleagues. Get yourself back into workspace again. So I was talking to a pilot not long ago, and he had said to me that one of the things he'd done to get back into workspace was actually to put his uniform on, even though he wasn't going to work. He actually put his uniform on then because it was almost symbolic of him getting back into work mode. And it also signaled to the people he lived with that that's what he was doing. But putting some time aside to speak with colleagues and to talk about aviation things. I know some people have been doing that, but others haven't. And particularly if you haven't been able to maintain contacts with colleagues, which is often the case in the larger scheduled airlines, then it's important to get back to doing that. Part of it also is beginning to get into the headspace of work and reading aviation material, and particularly reviewing notes from when you got your license, and often looking again at reports that came out of sim checks, or reports, that things that came back from your last round of recurrent training. Those are the sorts of things to look at. And the captain that was talking to me about putting his uniform back on, that's exactly what he was doing. He was doing that and then going and looking at all this information. And he found that actually gradually over the day, he found himself getting back into the headspace of work once more. Another way of doing this is what we call a virtual sim session. Some of you might be familiar with this. Basically what it is using visualization. It's sitting in a chair, shutting your eyes and visualizing in your head the layout of your normal workplace. So, you know, if you sit in the left-hand seat or the right-hand seat in whatever aircraft you normally fly, sit, shut your eyes and just visualize where the controls are. It helps also if you can do some bodily movements so that you actually do put your hands on where the controls would be. A warning, people watching you do this will think you have absolutely lost your mind. So maybe do this in a place where you're not going to be looked at by other people who may think something rather odd is going on. No, you're not having hallucinations and delusions. You're doing this quite specifically. But it is a way of doing it, and actually re-invoking again the muscle memory of operating the aircraft is great in the absence of being able to actually physically get in the aircraft and do it, which obviously will come. Speaking to a number of pilots who've been doing that, they've said how valuable that has been to them when they've then been able to get back in the sim prior to operating the aircraft again. It's also worthwhile looking at your own feedback, going back and saying, well, what have people told you? Are there skills you could start to work on now that would then bear fruit later on? And sometimes performance feedback from line checks, from sim checks, is a good thing to look at now as a way of thinking through what you may do, because it will guide the second point on the checklist, the reading material. And it may also guide the third point, the sim session, the visualization session as well. So worth doing that too. So those are the 4 areas to look at in getting yourself prepared in terms of your brain. Okay, remember, if you have any questions, pop them into chat. We'll catch them all at the end. Okay, let's move on. Those are the bodily things, the rational things, but actually what you also need to think about is how you handle the emotional aspect of returning to work. And it's an area that's often neglected. So there are a number of areas to look at. We know that people will have experienced very different emotions during the period of quarantine. For example, people will have been frustrated, not being able to do the job that you trained for, not being able to do the thing that you love doing, which is my experience, what most pilots say about flying. And there's a great deal of frustration. Even as operations begin again, there is even more frustration for a number of reasons. Not everybody is going back to work at the same time. And there's nothing worse than seeing colleagues getting back into uniform and taking aircraft out, and you're not able to do the same. It doubles your frustration. People are feeling a great deal of anxiety, the possible decay of their skills. I'm working with a pilot just now in the UK who is quite anxious about getting back into operation again because it's re-invoked his anxiety about being in the sim. But also added on to that is the potential financial consequences, not only of not having operated, but the parlous state that aviation is in worldwide at the moment, with virtually every scheduled airline and other operators too looking to downsize their workforce because of decreased demand. The decrease has been absolutely incredibly steep. Edinburgh Airport, my local airport, normally handles something like 9 million passengers a year. It's in the last few months has handled only 700,000. So an enormous decrease in activity, which you're probably aware of yourselves. And that drives anxiety as well about job security. People have often felt lonely. People have felt missing the day-to-day interaction with colleagues, sitting, having a coffee in the crew room, having a banter with people, or perhaps even just sitting, having a conversation over the cockpit. So there's a great deal of loneliness, particularly if you're somebody who lives on their own and doesn't have contact with colleagues, which can be the case. Some people are angry, anger at not having information about where things might be, not being given clear indication of when they're going to be operating again. The anger is heightened at the moment, certainly in the UK, because things look like they're getting back to normal, and then they go back again with a second wave of COVID infections. So there's a great deal of anger, and I've noticed it generally in the population. People at this point are getting angry because they thought they were through it, but they're not. And the anger gets directed at all sorts of people. The government, it gets directed at the people who they think haven't been following the regulations, etc. And some people, of course, do experience depression, really at the enormity of the situation. The death toll, particularly if it's affected them directly. I believe the pilots in that Pakistani International Airlines crash actually had direct relatives who they'd lost through COVID-19. So you can understand the distraction and perhaps the feelings that had brought about. But we should say, for some people, it's caused some positive emotions. The relief from the usual hectic life of rosters and schedules and getting up and getting going. It's actually given a relief and a bit of breathing space for some people. And occasionally it's actually brought a great deal of joy, being able to spend time with the family that they maybe didn't have before, being able to spend time outdoors in the fresh air, which is sometimes all you can do. So the emotions are there. The emotions need also careful handling in the transition back into work. And if we look at this diagram here, which is the emotional impact of change and transition, we know that people's self-confidence and their effectiveness, in other words, how well they perform their job, can vary over time as changes happen. And we know it tends to be a curve that looks something like this. At the beginning, people feel quite elated. Great, I'm going back to work. I've got a date for restarting. But then stronger emotions often kick in. There's frustration that things aren't happening as quickly as possible. There's irritation over the new regulations, the new ways in which aircraft have to operate, the fact you've got to sit with your mask on all the time, the fact that you've got the distancing and so on. So you often get into the situation where these things really start to generate a great deal of irritation, but then also strong emotions. Sometimes there's anger that things aren't happening quickly. Sometimes there's often a great deal of uncertainty about where things are going to go, particularly at the moment as things are changing and then changing back again. And at the middle of this, people often begin to feel low. Luckily, most people are resilient. We do know that pilots are often more resilient than most people. And so over time, people start to accept that things are happening and they explore the new ways of working that are evident. And eventually, they then come to a point where they consolidate what they've learned. They begin to realize the value of the experience and how they've dealt with it. And one of the things I encourage a great deal is people reflecting on their feelings about things and also reflecting what they have learned through the process. So people move through this. Many of you will be familiar with those stages from other changes and transitions. The same thing will have happened when you moved into quarantine, and the same thing will happen as you move out of it. So it's not just a once-off process. This will happen again as you move back through getting back into the workplace again. Okay, so what can you do about it? How do you handle the way in which emotions can have an impact on you? Well, there are three main things. First of all, you have to name and recognize the feelings you experience. So reflect on what you experience and name it. Name the feelings. Are you feeling angry, depressed, happy, sad? It's worth understanding that those feelings are a normal part of change. That this happens to people, whatever change they're going through, and you can relate that to any change, whether that's a new job, a new baby, a new relationship, or getting back into the cockpit after a period of not flying. And it's worthwhile, we know one of the key things about dealing with those emotions is talking openly about it, having a conversation about feelings. I do know, having worked with many pilots, that actually they're not often the easiest people to talk about feelings. So, this is maybe something unusual and different, but it is quite essential in handling this emotional process of returning into the workplace again. So here's our checklist. First thing to do is reflect. How are you feeling about getting back to flying? Have an honest conversation with yourself. How are you feeling about it? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling absolutely elated and really joyful that you're getting back to doing the job? Are you feeling a bit depressed about it because you're going to have to leave behind a fairly nice period of time where you've had time with your partner and family? So reflect on it and honestly name these emotions. Talk to somebody about it. Talk to your partner. We'll look in a minute at the relationships and how you need to handle those. Talk to perhaps your close friends or perhaps even your colleague about how you're feeling. It's great to, if you are on a sort of work WhatsApp group, as I know many people are, how are people managing this? How are they feeling just now? How are they feeling about going back to work? Have those conversations. If you have pilot peer support available, use it. And of course, this has been put on with the cooperation of Mayday South Africa, which is exactly that. So there is a source for you. As I mentioned earlier on, pilot peer support programs are mandated from February 14th. 2021 in the EASA jurisdiction. So it will become increasingly common for pilots to be able to talk to a peer and get support around how things are having an impact on them, whether that's a critical incident or in this process, whether it's part of the change process of returning to work. I have to give a rider here. If you are seriously concerned about your ability to return to work and handle an aircraft safely, you have to speak to your flight ops management if you are a scheduled airline pilot. You have to notify them that you have concerns. And I know that is a duty, certainly on the back of the CAA UK license. It says you have a duty to self-declare if you think you are not fit to operate an aircraft safely. Same thing applies, I'm sure, in South Africa. So if you are seriously concerned, please take some action about it and notify the relevant people. Okay, we're getting there. The fourth area is how you maintain your relationships. Probably you've already made some readjustment to the strange pattern of relationships many scheduled airline pilots have. Most pilots I know, particularly where both partners are pilots, manage to develop an equilibrium in the relationship when they are normally operating. However, that will have changed because you will have been taken from that situation into another one where the equilibrium perhaps is altered. Now you've maybe worked through that. Maybe it's been a good experience. It may have been a bad experience. Maybe your partner is desperate to see the back of you back to work because you got under their feet. Well, it does happen. But it certainly has been a change. And what getting back into work implies is a further change back perhaps to the original situation. But whatever happens, it means a change for you in terms of how you deal with that relationship. And it's quite important to have that conversation. And it's not too early to start that conversation with partners and family so that they're prepared for you going back to work again. I gave the example earlier of somebody who was physically putting his uniform on. And again, that was a signal to partner and family, to kids, that actually the workplace was beginning to come up again and that somebody was beginning to get themselves back into work mode. So what do I suggest? First of all, have a think. How can you keep the good things going that you maybe have enjoyed? If this has been a good experience for you, where you've been with friends and family and you've had a chance certainly to spend more time playing with young children, it's been good. How do you keep that going? How do you adjust the working relationship back to what it was, but at the same time, keep some of the positive things going? And it's a good idea just to think through how you manage that. It's really important, if you have children, to talk to them now about how and why you are returning. For young, particularly very young children, they will not understand the context as well. And so for them, it's all of a sudden, daddy and mummy are here full time, and then they've gone again. And very often the conclusion children draw is it's something they did. But actually, if you explain the situation to them and explain how it will be going back to perhaps a previous situation, so much the better. And even young children need that explanation. Obviously different with older children, but even then, it's worth having that explanation. It's worthwhile discussing with them the context of you going back to work again and preparing them for the fact that perhaps life is going to change back again. And they particularly will have enjoyed that. And I know certainly in the UK, children have been off school for a good period of time. And parents have been homeschooling them and have been doing activities with them, which they've thoroughly enjoyed in some cases. And so going back into it is perhaps a bit of a disappointment for the children because they're losing some of that great contact they've had. So preparation is important. And as part of that, then you perhaps need to discuss the childcare arrangements. Doubly important if you are both pilots, because it means you perhaps need to re-invoke some of the ways in which you dealt with childcare before. And lastly, it's good to help everybody see the positive side of you returning to work. As I said before, sometimes your partner may be really glad to be rid of you because you've been hanging about the house, and they may be glad to get their personal space back. But joking aside, actually, there's a positive side to it. We know that people's self-esteem, and this is no different for pilots than any other profession, their self-esteem comes from doing the job and having that identity of being somebody in the workplace. It is particularly strong in pilots. Go back to the example I gave about the pilot putting the uniform again. What's that about? Identity. I am a pilot. And going back to that builds somebody's self-esteem. And so people will see that there's a real positive side of it again. And of course, as work begins to ramp up again, so it begins to alleviate some of the financial issues that have obviously caused some of the anxieties we talked about beforehand. So help people see the positive side of that. Those 5 things are about yourself. And the last one that I want to talk about is really how you maintain your own mental well-being. I'm going to put up a short scale of mental well-being. And what I'd like you to do is look at it and rate you up where you are now, listening to this presentation on this measure of well-being. It's called the Short Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. So have a look at it now and say, where are you on these 7 items? Okay, the average for the general population is 21. So hopefully you've scored above 21. If you haven't, then there are some things you maybe need to do to look at your own mental well-being and how you can do it and maintain it. One of the operators I work with, actually West Atlantic, actually uses this scale as a regular check on pilot well-being. Avianca, the South American airline I work with, asked me to produce this in a slightly enlarged form for pilots in Spanish, obviously. And what they have done is they've issued it to pilots and asked them to self-monitor their well-being whilst they've been under quarantine. So every 2 weeks, they need to take a check on where they are. And that's particularly becoming important because they recommenced operations on the 1st of September and they're beginning to increase the frequency of them. And it's a way of just taking a check on where individual people are, and self-monitoring is important. It's well worth using something like this as you go through the process of returning to work, just keeping a regular check on yourself. As I said, if you score under 21, don't panic, don't worry, because well-being can change. It's not an indication of a long-term mental health problem. It might be something in the longer term if it goes on a long period of time, but at the moment it's not, and it's something where you can work on it. And what I'm going to show you now is a slide which isn't easy to read, I know, but actually is well worth having a think about, because it's the ways in which you can improve your mental well-being and then maintain it. It's what we call 5 a day, the 5 a day of diet. Well, this is the 5 a day of mental well-being. And there are 5 areas that you can do that maintain and build your mental well-being. The first of these is connecting with other people. Now, obviously, we've come across an issue there because one of the reasons why things like anxiety and depression have increased over quarantine period is because people have not been able to connect with each other. I have a group of friends I haven't seen since March because we can't get together. A couple of them are older and are shielding, so they've not been able even to go out of the house. So not being able to connect has a huge impact on people's mental health. But in the positive light, actually doing that starts to increase mental well-being. Hence me saying things like get on things like WhatsApp groups, talk to people, connect with others. There's a thing becoming more and more popular, which is what we call the social cure. And the social cure in the social treatment programs are things where people are prescribed group activities because we know the importance of getting together with other people. There is research to show that people recover from depression quicker when they are part of a group than if they're doing it on their own, and even more effectively than if they just get medication. So actually being with people is important. It builds your well-being. So think of ways in which you can do that now. Being active is the next one. We know that physical well-being and mental well-being are closely linked. And so raising your physical well-being by being active also raises your mental well-being. So do stuff, get outside and walk and do things. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I'd spent a lot of time just walking from the house here. I can walk through the countryside, and that really helped both maintain my physical well-being, but it also maintained my mental well-being, because it's a form of what we call mindfulness. You can really only concentrate on what you're doing when you're walking. Take notice of things round about you. Take notice of what's going on in the world. If you go back to what I was suggesting about getting your brain prepared, take notice about what's happening in aviation. Now, I know you're all going to say, but it's pretty depressing. Yes, I understand that, the way things are at the moment. But even then, it's worthwhile starting to take notice of what's happening around the world in terms of aviation. Go back and look at some of the information you had. So it relates back that particular item to getting your brain prepared. And likewise, the next one, keep learning. That is why I was suggesting that you spend time looking at previous performance information, looking at your old notes that you may have taken on CRM programs, etc. The last way in which you can improve your well-being is by giving things back to other people. Give some time to others, help other people, ask other people how they are. And again, go back to what we talked about in terms of the emotional thing, speak about it with other people. Think about how you can give some things back to the community. One of the things that's happened, certainly over the quarantine period in the UK, is pilots have been giving back to their local community. There was a thing called Project Wingman, which is set up by the main union, BALPA, which encouraged pilots to go in and volunteer in hospitals by providing time and facilities for staff rest breaks. And that proved very popular. It's winding down now. In fact, I think it's closed, but it was a way of people giving back to others. Okay, we've come to the end of the presentation. Really, I hope it's been useful for you. And I just reiterate again, if you would like a copy of the guide, please go on and download it. That is our website. If you go onto the website, you can just click on it and download it straight away. I do encourage you to do that if you haven't already done so, and use it in a practical way. It really is intended for people to use as a practical document. If you have specific questions, I can see there are some in the questions and answer, and I'll address them now. If you have something that's more personal, please contact me. I'm quite happy to do that. Or if you want to get in touch with Mayday South Africa, contact Jaco, and he will be able, I'm sure, also to point you in the right direction. But certainly, occasionally people do contact me with questions that are rather more personal that you don't really want to put into the public domain. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been of use to you and continues to be of use to you. And I will stop sharing my screen now and take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul Dickens, all the way from Scotland. We really appreciate your insight. And you know, what amazes me is in the aviation industry, how people are still investing their time, and I've seen it for so many years, not trying to make money out of aviation, but when it comes to safety, that people invest their effort into it, and we want to honor you for that. Thank you very much also for the effort in writing that guideline. It's also available from Mayday. Good. And, I just, you mentioned a couple of interesting things before we jump to the questions. around getting into the headspace of aviation, and you may not have been flying for a long time, and how to get into that. And could you speak perhaps to the general aviation? I'm just thinking about a businessman that's flying around, and maybe not so often, and it's picking up now. But what I actually heard was the importance of linking up with your local flying club or flight school in getting into that right headspace.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, one of the source materials for my guide was a document called the Rusty Pilot's Guide to Returning to Flying, which is aimed at general aviation pilots. So I would recommend, as much as my guide, the Rusty Pilot's Guide. It's available. You'll see the link in the guide to download it, because it's a very practical guide that talks you through the things you must do before you get into that aircraft again and do anything else. And part of that is getting back into the headspace again of flying and imagining yourself in the cockpit, but also going and talking to people, going back to the flying club and talking to them. So yeah, I couldn't stress more strongly that is well worth having a look at if you are a general aviation pilot.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Kobus Turin, and he says, thank you, Paul, very human orientated and informative, certainly appropriate for all returning to flying. And he says that IFALPA and EASA have got similar checklists for returning to flying, but more aimed at airline operations and not in such HF detail as what you have provided here now. And then he's just asking, are you collaborating with IFALPA at all?
Not with IFALPA. The guide has been sent and used as a guide material by the UK regulator, the CAA. It also went into EASA and also has gone to the ECA, European Cockpit Association. So the main pilots sort of representative bodies have got hold of this. BALPA, the British Airline Pilots Association, also circulated it to all their pilots. And in the States, it went out via the unions to pilots in United particularly. So it has had that circulation. And you're right, I have seen both of those checklists. They were certainly written with the thought of the guide behind it. The CAA guidance particularly has done that. The one that's closest to it is the Colombian regulator, who has actually almost physically imported the Spanish version of the guide into their guidance for operators in South America. So it's been quite influential that way without specifically going through IFALPA.
Thank you. Thank you. One question here also from Craig Wood. He says, flying is almost like being bipolar. It's awesome to get back, but we leave our family and friends behind. We return to earning an income again. How would you suggest managing their emotions? You've touched on it. Can you give us a couple of additional tips on managing those emotions at home?
The key to it is communication. The key to it is having that conversation and preparing people for it, and preparing people not just for the practicalities of it, but also preparing people for the impact it might have on them. But of course, you can't do that unless you're aware of the impact on yourself first. So it has to start with some reflection about how you might be feeling about it. And then I think a very honest conversation, particularly with a partner, about the impact it's going to have. And I can't stress enough as well about, if you have children, particularly younger children, is having conversations with them and discussing the fact that they may feel that, you know, it's going to be so disappointing that, you know, daddy or mummy isn't going to be there like they were over the last wee while. But I think it's explaining to them that they will feel quite naturally disappointed with it. So I think, you know, be aware of the situation and go back to that curve, that they will go through that same emotional transition curve as you will. And I think the only way around it, as we know of, is voicing it, talking about it, having conversations around how people will feel with it, and don't miss out even young children in that.
Yeah, I think in our house, the only people that will be glad if I go back to work would be the teenagers.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Rob Jonkers. It's our last question here.
Yeah.
He says there's been a lot of discussion during lockdown of loss of proficiency and skills, which is limited skills loss over time, where skills get to a point that becomes problematic or dangerous.
That's a good point. I think, I mean, the first part of that is a self-assessment. But I think for most operators, that is happening as part of a proficiency check anyway. So with scheduled operators, and certainly if, you know, obviously general aviation pilots is different, but with scheduled airline pilots, most operators have put in place a proficiency check in the sim before you get anywhere near the aircraft again. And I think what perhaps is missing there is the anxiety that people are feeling about it. And I've certainly come across a few referrals to me of people who have become increasingly anxious that they may have lost the skills prior even to getting in the sim, to having a check about where their skills are. So I think that's where the barometer is. It comes in that situation, which is exactly where most operators are then going with in terms of checks and assessments of skill prior to getting back in the aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. We must never underestimate the value in the general aviation side of asking somebody to fly with you for a while. I think just a pair of eyes and ears to get you back on track makes a huge difference. But thank you, Rob. What I'm reading here is actually an opportunity for somebody in aviation interested in a master's or a PhD research topic. This sounds really exciting and worthwhile at a global level.
I think it really would be if somebody picked that up as an issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this session. So if you would allow me, unfortunately, I have to listen to me for a couple of minutes. I'll apologize up front. I know Neil in the beginning asked if he could do the thank you notes, and I asked him rather not to do that, because I want to say a special thank you to Messi Frankfurt and to AERO South Africa for the amazing work that you have done in making this possible and allowing Mayday to partner with you in this way. And then especially for Annelie Reynolds. Annelie, south of the Nile, we think you're the best. You should see her operate amongst the group of men trying to keep us on track. It's pretty impressive. And then last but not least, I would like to say thank you to Mr. Paul Dickens, sir, again, for your time, your effort from starting to write that guideline and joining us here tonight, and what you're doing for aviation globally. We want to honor you and want to say thank you so much. We really appreciate you and what you're doing for our industry. Thank you.
Appreciate that. I hope to see you in South Africa one day when travel is easier.
We're looking forward to that. We'll exchange whiskey and red wine.
Well, that's where I'm going next when I finish this, is a glass of red wine. So.
Great. Thank you again. It's been wonderful.